In the early 17th century, a small kingdom on the western coast of Central Africa became a theater for one of the most extraordinary stories of resistance against European colonialism. The Kingdom of Ndongo, a land rich in culture, heritage, and strategic importance, would serve as the backdrop for the emergence of a powerful figure who would defy the Portuguese Empire, Queen Nzinga. The Portuguese had long sought to expand their influence over the region, establishing a foothold in Angola for the purpose of trading, notably in slaves, ivory, and other valuable resources. Yet, for all their efforts, they were about to encounter a formidable adversary who would alter the course of their ambitions. At the time, the Portuguese had been present in Angola for over a century, having first made contact with the kingdoms of the region in the late 15th century. Their primary interest was in the lucrative transatlantic slave trade, and they quickly established settlements along the coastline to serve as hubs for this trade. They allied themselves with local African rulers, exploiting existing rivalries and tensions between different kingdoms. In many cases, this strategy allowed them to secure access to resources and labor while promising protection or favorable trade terms in return. Yet the Portuguese underestimated the will and resilience of the African rulers they sought to manipulate. Nzinga's early life in the Kingdom of Ndongo would have been shaped by the complexities of these political dynamics. As a young woman, she would have witnessed firsthand the tensions between the Portuguese and her people. The Kingdom of Ndongo, under the rule of her brother, King Colonial, had been grappling with the increasing demands of the Portuguese. They were imposing heavy taxes, extracting tribute, and forcing military conscription to fuel their expansionist agenda. Yet despite these challenges, the people of Ndongo remained proud and resistant. It was in this environment that Nzinga's character would begin to form, marked by intelligence, diplomacy, and an understanding of the strategic importance of alliances. Nzinga's rise to prominence was, in part, due to the complex political situation in which she found herself. King Colonial, who ruled Ndongo, had initially sought to maintain a delicate balance between resisting Portuguese influence and preserving his kingdom's autonomy. However, the relentless Portuguese incursions placed the kingdom in a precarious position, and by the early 1620s, Ndongo was facing the prospect of losing its independence altogether. The Portuguese, recognizing the strategic value of Ndongo's territory, sought to strengthen their grip by exploiting internal divisions within the kingdom. At this juncture, Queen Nzinga's diplomatic acumen became crucial. Nzinga was known for her ability to navigate the intricacies of court politics and international relations. As a skilled negotiator, she was called upon by her brother to represent Ndongo in discussions with the Portuguese. The meeting took place in 1622 in the city of Luanda, a Portuguese stronghold, where Nzinga's ability to command respect would be tested in ways she had never anticipated. The meeting itself was a symbolic moment in the history of African resistance against European colonial powers. It was here that Nzinga would first encounter the full force of the Portuguese arrogance. When she arrived at the Portuguese governor's residence, she was confronted with the sight of Portuguese officials seated comfortably, while she, as the representative of sovereign African kingdom, was expected to sit on the floor. The disrespect was blatant, a manifestation of the Portuguese assumption that African rulers and their people were subservient to European superiority. But Queen Nzinga would not be cowed by this display of power. In a move that would cement her legacy as a master of strategy and diplomacy, Nzinga ordered a servant to kneel down so that she could use him as a chair. This act of defiance, though subtle, was a powerful statement against the Portuguese assumption of superiority. It was also a sign of her determination to protect her kingdom's dignity and resist the growing Portuguese encroachment. The governor, perhaps sensing the tension, offered her a chair, but Nzinga's message was clear: she would not bow to Portuguese arrogance. This encounter marked the beginning of Nzinga's long and complicated relationship with the Portuguese. Initially, the negotiations seemed to go in favor of the Portuguese, and King Colonial was forced to accept certain terms that further entrenched their presence in Ndongo. However, The diplomatic failure of this first meeting would not be the end of Nzinga's efforts. She knew that her kingdom's survival depended not only on negotiating peace with the Portuguese, but on preparing for the inevitable conflict that would arise if they continued their attempts at domination. Nzinga's strategy was multifaceted. While she sought peace through diplomacy, she also began to strengthen her kingdom's military forces, recruiting soldiers and forming alliances with other African states. Her efforts were not only aimed at the Portuguese, but also at the rival kingdoms within the region. The Portuguese had frequently played these kingdoms against one another, but Nzinga recognized that true resistance required unity. She forged alliances with neighboring peoples, including the Mbangala, a group of mercenaries who would later prove invaluable in her fight against the Portuguese. Her efforts to unite the different factions of Angola were not without obstacles. The rivalries between the kingdoms were deeply rooted, and many of the leaders were hesitant to join Nzinga's cause, unsure of her ability to succeed. Yet Nzinga's persuasive abilities, combined with her growing reputation as a determined and intelligent leader, allowed her to form a coalition that would prove vital in the years to come. Nzinga's rise also coincided with the shifting dynamics of the Portuguese colonial project. In the early 17th century, the Portuguese were embroiled in conflicts elsewhere, including in Brazil, and their ability to sustain a prolonged military campaign in Angola was weakening. The Portuguese also faced growing resistance from other African rulers, including the powerful Congo Kingdom to the north, which had been fighting to reclaim its autonomy from Portuguese control. These factors contributed to a shifting power dynamic in Angola, one that Nzinga was keenly aware of. By the time she took control of Ndongo, Nzinga had already proven herself a capable leader and a fierce opponent of Portuguese imperialism. As the Portuguese continued to push for domination, Nzinga's role as a defender of African sovereignty became ever more pronounced. Her unwavering commitment to her people and her ability to combine diplomacy with military strategy would ultimately set the stage for the fierce battles that would follow. Her actions in the early stages of her resistance laid the foundation for the larger, more intense struggle to come. While the Portuguese were still largely in control of the coastal areas, Nzinga's preparations were setting the stage for a long and bitter conflict. The outcome of this struggle would have far-reaching consequences, not only for the Kingdom of Ndongo, but for the future of African resistance to European colonization in the region. Nzinga's legacy, as a queen who defied one of the most powerful empires of her time, would eventually become an enduring symbol of African resistance to foreign domination. But this was only the beginning of her journey, one that would see her rise to become one of Africa's most formidable and inspiring leaders. As Queen Nzinga continued to navigate the complexities of her kingdom's struggle against Portuguese encroachment, the situation in Ndongo grew ever more dire. Despite her initial diplomatic efforts, the Portuguese maintained their pressure on the region, determined to consolidate their power and expand their influence over the resource-rich lands of Angola. King Ngolamband, Nzinga's brother, had been forced to make compromises with the Portuguese, but the terms of these agreements were becoming increasingly oppressive. The alliance between the Portuguese and local African rulers was fragile, held together by mutual convenience. But it was clear that the Portuguese sought more than just cooperation. They were intent on subjugating the people of Ndongo. Nzinga, having observed the unfolding events with growing concern, understood that the survival of her kingdom could no longer rely solely on diplomatic negotiations. While her efforts at securing peace had bought her time, they had not changed the fundamental power dynamics between the Portuguese and the African kingdoms of the region. The pressure on Ndongo was mounting, and war seemed inevitable. In this charged atmosphere, Nzinga's role within the court of Ndongo grew more significant. She had already demonstrated remarkable diplomatic skills in her confrontation with the Portuguese in Luanda, but now she began to position herself as a key player in the defense of the kingdom. Her brother, King Ngolamband, was increasingly debilitated by internal political pressures, external threats, and the constant demands from the Portuguese. His inability to effectively lead Ndongo against the Portuguese occupation had left a vacuum of leadership, one that Nzinga would soon fill. Although her rise to power had been gradual, Nzinga was not an unfamiliar figure in the court of Ndongo. As a princess, she had been well educated in matters of governance, diplomacy, and military strategy. She had observed firsthand the consequences of appeasing the Portuguese and understood that the survival of her kingdom depended on its ability to resist colonization through both warfare and political maneuvering. Her political acumen was sharpened through years of observing the machinations of the Portuguese and other African leaders, learning to anticipate their strategies and weaknesses. Nzinga's keen understanding of the broader political landscape also gave her a unique advantage in forging alliances with neighboring African kingdoms. While the Portuguese had sought to divide and conquer the various African states, Nzinga recognized that unity was essential to resisting foreign domination. She began to build a coalition of African kingdoms, recruiting soldiers and mercenaries from among the Mbangala, a group of fierce and skilled warriors who had long been hostile to Portuguese influence in Angola. With their help, Nzinga would be able to mount a more formidable challenge to the Portuguese in the coming years. At this time, King Ngolamban's position became increasingly untenable. His attempts to balance the demands of the Portuguese with the needs of his people were failing. The Portuguese, emboldened by their success in controlling the coast and their growing influence over local leaders, began to push further inland, encroaching on the heart of Ndongo's territory. The Portuguese also began to undermine the authority of Ngolamban, openly challenging his leadership and supporting rival factions within his kingdom. Nzinga, aware of her brother's struggles, knew that she could not stand idly by as the Portuguese tore apart the kingdom. It was around this time that Nzinga took the bold step of assuming direct leadership of Ndongo. As her brother's power continued to wane, she began to rally support among the military and the people of Ndongo, organizing them into a more cohesive and coordinated force. She knew that the strength of the kingdom lay not only in its military might, but in its ability to unite the different factions within its borders. Nzinga's efforts to rally support for her cause were not just political. They were deeply personal. She saw herself as the protector of Ndongo's legacy and its sovereignty. For her, this was a battle for the survival of her people, a chance to preserve their way of life in the face of an increasingly aggressive European colonial power. With the help of her growing network of allies, Nzinga began to organize military campaigns against the Portuguese. The early phases of the conflict were marked by guerrilla tactics and ambushes, as Nzinga sought to wear down the Portuguese forces and prevent them from consolidating their control. She knew that the Portuguese were heavily reliant on their fortified coastal settlements, and so her strategy was to target their supply lines and disrupt their ability to maintain a foothold in the interior. Nzinga's military strategy was pragmatic, combining both offensive and defensive tactics. She recognized the importance of leveraging the natural terrain of Angola to her advantage, using forests, rivers, and mountains to conceal her forces and launch surprise attacks. Her understanding of the land and its people allowed her to mobilize her army efficiently, striking quickly and retreating before the Portuguese could mount an effective counteroffensive. At the same time, Nzinga continued her diplomatic efforts, attempting to weaken the Portuguese position through alliances with European powers who were hostile to Portugal. Her ability to balance military action with diplomacy was one of her greatest strengths. She sought to ensure that the Portuguese were facing multiple fronts, stretching their resources and forcing them to divide their attention between Angola and other colonial ventures. Nzinga's approach was one of calculated patience, recognizing that the conflict would not be won in a single battle but through a sustained campaign of resistance. Nzinga's leadership also inspired a sense of unity among the people of Ndongo. As the Portuguese continued their occupation, the kingdom's people rallied behind Nzinga's vision of an independent Ndongo free from foreign domination. Her military campaigns began to win small victories, and with each success, her reputation grew. Word of her leadership spread beyond Ndongo's borders, inspiring other African kingdoms to join the fight against the Portuguese. Despite these successes, the Portuguese were not easily defeated. Their military forces, although stretched thin, remained formidable. The Portuguese had superior weaponry and a well-established presence in Angola, which made their position difficult to dislodge. Nzinga understood that she would need to outlast the Portuguese, wearing them down through a combination of military resistance and political maneuvering. By this point, the conflict between the Portuguese and Nzinga had become an existential struggle for the future of Ndongo. The Portuguese had made it clear that they would not stop until they had subjugated the kingdom, while Nzinga remained resolute in her determination to protect her people's freedom. The struggle was now as much about maintaining the morale of her people as it was about military strategy. Nzinga's leadership became a symbol of African resistance against European colonization, and her success in organizing both the military and the civilian population under her cause was unprecedented. The year following her assumption of power in Ndongo marked a period of intense conflict. Nzinga's military campaigns continued to challenge Portuguese dominance in the region, but it was clear that the struggle was far from over. Both sides would endure tremendous losses, and the outcome of the war would not be decided easily. Nzinga's resilience, however, would continue to inspire her people and her allies as the struggle for independence raged on. The early phase of Nzinga's war against the Portuguese had established her as a force to be reckoned with. Her blend of diplomatic savvy, military acumen, and unyielding commitment to her kingdom's independence made her a formidable opponent. But the road ahead would be long, and the conflict would test her in ways that she could never have anticipated. Despite the challenges, Nzinga remained steadfast in her vision for a free and sovereign Ndongo, one that would not fall prey to Portuguese ambitions. The tension between Queen Nzinga and the Portuguese continued to escalate as the early skirmishes turned into full-scale conflict. The initial successes of Nzinga's military campaigns had not been enough to dislodge the entrenched Portuguese forces, who, despite their setbacks, were not easily dissuaded. They were backed by superior weaponry, fortified coastal strongholds, and a network of alliances with rival African factions, all of which ensured that their hold on Angola was not easily broken. Yet, despite these formidable challenges, Nzinga remained resolute, determined to fight for the survival of her kingdom and the sovereignty of her people. By this stage, it was clear that the conflict would not be resolved through diplomacy alone. While Nzinga had excelled in negotiating with the Portuguese in the past, she understood that the Portuguese would only respect her kingdom's independence through force. If the Portuguese were to be driven out of Ndongo, they would have to be made to understand that resistance would come at a heavy cost. Nzinga's leadership, once defined by her diplomatic finesse, was now marked by an uncompromising determination to defend her people with military force. As the Portuguese intensified their military efforts, so too did Nzinga's resolve. The conflict soon reached a turning point, marked by a shift in Nzinga's strategy. Her earlier campaigns had focused on guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and raids against Portuguese supply lines, all of which had served to harry the Portuguese forces and slow their advance. Yet, as the Portuguese reinforced their positions and began to regroup, Nzinga recognized that the time had come for a more direct confrontation. The Portuguese had underestimated her, and now it was time to demonstrate the full measure of her military capability. Nzinga, drawing on her extensive knowledge of the terrain and the fighting methods of her allies, began to assemble a larger and more organized force. Her strategy was still rooted in flexibility, knowing that her army could not match the Portuguese in terms of sheer firepower. However, Nzinga's forces were determined, well-trained, and familiar with the land, giving them a distinct advantage when it came to maneuvering through the dense forests and rivers that dotted the Angolan landscape. She called upon the Mbangala warriors, whom she had befriended during her diplomatic outreach, as well as other local militias, to form a united front against the Portuguese invaders. The Mbangala, known for their fierce fighting style and fearsome reputation, were invaluable to Nzinga's forces, lending them both experience and numbers. With this expanded army, Nzinga began to stage more coordinated attacks, targeting Portuguese forts and key military positions. These direct assaults, though risky, were necessary to disrupt the Portuguese supply chain and weaken their ability to sustain operations in the region. Nzinga's forces executed these strikes with precision, knowing that the element of surprise was their greatest weapon. The Portuguese, accustomed to their superior military technology, were caught off guard by the intensity and organization of Nzinga's forces. The attacks were both psychological and physical blows to the Portuguese, who had believed themselves to be invulnerable in their fortified positions. However, as the conflict wore on, it became clear that the Portuguese were not easily dissuaded. They quickly regrouped and brought in reinforcement from their colonies, including soldiers from Brazil, to bolster their forces in Angola. They also sought to exploit the internal divisions within the African kingdoms of the region. While Nzinga had been successful in forging alliances with various groups, the Portuguese were adept at exploiting existing rivalries and pitting African leaders against each other. The Portuguese understood that if they could turn Nzinga's allies against her, they might be able to break her resistance and undermine her efforts to unify the region against their occupation. Nzinga, for her part, understood the precariousness of her position. As the Portuguese attempted to divide and conquer the various factions within Angola, Nzinga sought to maintain the unity of her alliance. She worked tirelessly to keep her allies loyal, reinforcing the idea that the struggle was not just about Ndongo, but about the future of all African kingdoms under threat from European colonial powers. Nzinga was not just a queen of Ndongo. She was becoming a symbol of resistance for all African peoples facing European domination. Her leadership was not only about military strategy, but about forging a common cause among disparate African groups. In the midst of these military and political struggles, Nzinga faced personal challenges as well. Her brother, King Ngolamband, who had initially been the leader of Ndongo, had retreated into a defensive position, increasingly dependent on the Portuguese for survival. His inability to lead effectively had weakened the kingdom's ability to mount a cohesive defense. Nzinga, ever the pragmatist, understood that her brother's authority had waned and that she could not afford to wait for his leadership to turn the tide of the war. Despite her deep respect for her brother, Nzinga assumed full command of Ndongo's military and political strategies, knowing that the fate of her kingdom rested on her shoulders alone. Her assumption of full leadership was not without consequences. Nzinga's bold actions earned her the respect of her allies, but they also made her a target for the Portuguese and rival African factions. The Portuguese were particularly keen to discredit Nzinga and undermine her efforts, viewing her as the greatest threat to their ambitions in Angola. To counter this, they began spreading rumors and propaganda about Nzinga's character, attempting to paint her as a power-hungry ruler who sought to undermine the African traditions she was supposedly trying to protect. Yet these efforts only served to strengthen Nzinga's resolve. She remained unfazed by the attacks on her character, focusing instead on the larger goal of defending her kingdom and her people. The military conflict reached a crucial juncture when the Portuguese launched a major offensive against Ndongo. They sought to crush the resistance once and for all by overwhelming Nzinga's forces with superior numbers and firepower. The battle for Ndongo was intense, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The Portuguese, despite their technological advantages, were surprised by the resilience and tactics of Nzinga's forces, who fought fiercely to defend their homeland. The battle was a fierce contest of wills. Nzinga's forces, though outgunned, were fighting for survival, while the Portuguese were intent on asserting their dominance over a region they had long sought to control. Despite the ferocity of the battle, the Portuguese were unable to decisively defeat Nzinga's forces. They had underestimated the depth of her commitment to her people and the strength of her alliances. The battle for Ndongo ended in a tactical stalemate, with both sides suffering heavy losses but no clear victor emerging. The Portuguese, recognizing that they could not easily overcome Nzinga's forces, began to shift their strategy, seeking a more diplomatic resolution to the conflict. However, Nzinga was not ready to compromise. She understood that any negotiation with the Portuguese would only be a temporary solution. The Portuguese had demonstrated time and again that they would not honor agreements, and Nzinga knew that they would continue to encroach upon her kingdom if given the chance. The war was far from over, and Nzinga's determination to fight on became even more resolute. She knew that the future of her kingdom, and the future of African resistance to European colonialism, depended on her ability to hold her ground and inspire her people to continue the struggle. In the aftermath of the battle, Nzinga's reputation as a fierce and determined leader spread even further. Her military tactics, her ability to unite disparate factions, and her unwavering commitment to her people made her an enduring symbol of resistance. But the war was far from over. Nzinga's greatest challenge lay ahead as she faced the unrelenting force of Portuguese imperialism. Yet, with each victory, each setback, and each new alliance, Nzinga grew more determined to ensure that her people would never be subjugated by foreign rule. The battle for Ndongo was only one chapter in a larger struggle for the future of Africa. The struggle between Queen Nzinga and the Portuguese was evolving into something much larger than a battle for the survival of a single kingdom. As each day passed, the fight against the European invaders became not just a political or military contest, but a profound ideological battle for sovereignty, dignity, and the future of African independence. While Nzinga's kingdom of Ndongo faced mounting pressure from the Portuguese, her resolve only hardened. Despite the continuous onslaught from the colonizers, Nzinga's leadership was beginning to transcend her immediate struggle. She had become a symbol of African resistance against European imperialism, and the stakes of the war were now larger than the survival of Ndongo alone. As the Portuguese intensified their campaign, they relied increasingly on their superior firepower. The small coastal settlements that had once served as mere outposts were transformed into well-fortified bastions, and their military presence in Angola became more entrenched. With the backing of their European allies and a continued influx of troops, the Portuguese were hoping to end the war in their favor. They hoped that the weight of their military advantage would force Nzinga to negotiate on their terms. The Portuguese, however, underestimated the resolve of the Queen and her people. They had failed to grasp the deep conviction that drove Nzinga. The fight for independence was not just about military victory, but about the preservation of her people's identity and their refusal to be subjugated by foreign rule. Nzinga, understanding the strategic importance of time and the long-term nature of the struggle, began to adopt a more methodical approach to warfare. Realizing that she could not defeat the Portuguese in a single, decisive confrontation, she focused her efforts on a protracted war of attrition. Her strategy was designed to wear down the Portuguese forces, make their presence in Angola increasingly untenable, and weaken their morale. This approach, while slow and costly, would eventually break the Portuguese will to fight and force them to recognize that they could not control the region without facing immense resistance. The tactics Nzinga employed were often unconventional and highly effective. As the Portuguese attempted to consolidate their hold on the interior of the country, Nzinga's forces launched a series of raids against Portuguese convoys and military positions. These operations were designed not only to inflict damage, but to demonstrate that the Portuguese, no matter how many soldiers they brought to Angola, could never truly control the land. The key to Nzinga's success lay in her understanding of the local geography. She knew how to use the terrain to her advantage, drawing upon the dense forests and rivers that were difficult for Portuguese forces to navigate. Her knowledge of the land made her military campaigns elusive and unpredictable, keeping the Portuguese in a constant state of uncertainty and fear. Alongside these military efforts, Nzinga also sought to undermine the Portuguese through diplomacy. She was well aware that the Portuguese colonial project was built on fragile alliances with local African leaders, many of whom were less than enthusiastic about the Portuguese presence in their territories. Nzinga, ever the astute strategist, worked tirelessly to drive wedges between the Portuguese and their African allies. She reached out to other African kingdoms, offering them support in their own battles against the Portuguese in exchange for their cooperation in resisting Portuguese domination. Her diplomatic efforts were aimed at creating a united front against the Portuguese, bringing together different ethnic groups and rival factions in a common cause. Despite her efforts to create a coalition of African states, the Portuguese remained determined to crush Nzinga's resistance. As the fighting continued, they mounted a series of large-scale military campaigns designed to break the spirit of the African forces. In 1624, they launched a major offensive against the Kingdom of Ndongo, hoping to end the conflict once and for all. This offensive was one of the largest and most coordinated attacks against Nzinga's forces, and it posed a significant threat to her kingdom's survival. The Portuguese forces, numbering in the thousands, advanced on Ndongo with a full military campaign, including heavy artillery, fortified positions, and reinforcements from their colonies. Nzinga, realizing that a direct confrontation with such a large and well-equipped force would likely result in disastrous consequences for her people, chose to retreat. This retreat was a difficult decision, one that would be interpreted by some as a sign of weakness, but Nzinga saw it as a necessary step in ensuring her kingdom's survival. She withdrew her forces strategically, drawing the Portuguese deeper into the interior of Angola and away from their coastal strongholds. In doing so, Nzinga successfully avoided a direct, decisive engagement, buying precious time to regroup and reorganize her forces. While the Portuguese were initially triumphant in this offensive, their victory was short-lived. They had, once again, underestimated the resilience and intelligence of their adversary. The retreat, far from being a defeat, was a tactical maneuver that would later pay dividends. Nzinga used this period of withdrawal to strengthen her alliances and secure reinforcements. She fortified her position in the interior, relying on the support of local tribes and neighboring kingdoms who shared her commitment to resisting the Portuguese. As she gained more support, she began to gather the resources necessary to launch a counteroffensive. Nzinga's ability to turn what seemed like a setback into an opportunity for regrouping and building strength was a testament to her leadership and military acumen. As the years wore on, the war continued to grind on, with no clear winner emerging. Nzinga's forces, although outnumbered and often under-equipped, fought with a determination that the Portuguese had not expected. The Portuguese, meanwhile, grew weary of the protracted conflict. Their presence in Angola had become increasingly costly, both in terms of lives lost and financial resources. The Portuguese, who had hoped to establish a profitable colony in Angola, now found themselves bogged down in a guerrilla war that showed no signs of ending. The local population, too, was growing weary of the conflict, and the Portuguese found it increasingly difficult to maintain control over the region's diverse and often hostile peoples. At this point, Nzinga's influence was beginning to spread beyond Ndongo. Her successful military campaigns and her ability to forge lasting alliances with other African leaders had made her an iconic figure in the resistance against European imperialism. She was not just the leader of Ndongo. She had become a symbol of African defiance and resilience. Her ability to unite disparate kingdoms and mobilize them against a common enemy was something the Portuguese had not anticipated. They had hoped that their superior technology and resources would be enough to subdue the African kingdoms, but they had not counted on the resolve of a leader like Nzinga. Nzinga's growing reputation began to have an impact on the wider geopolitical situation in Africa. Her resistance to Portuguese rule inspired other African kingdoms to reconsider their relationships with European powers. Nzinga's success in uniting African groups against the Portuguese also began to shift the balance of power in the region. The Portuguese, who had hoped to dominate Angola and use it as a base for further expansion into Central Africa, were now facing a well-organized and determined resistance that they could not easily defeat. The war, however, was far from over. The Portuguese would not abandon their ambitions in Angola easily, and Nzinga knew that she could not rely on her victories alone to secure her kingdom's future. As the conflict continued, Nzinga's focus shifted towards securing a lasting peace, one that would ensure the sovereignty of her kingdom and the freedom of her people. The nature of her struggle had changed. No longer was it just about resisting foreign invaders. It had become a fight for the very survival of the African nations against a growing tide of European colonialism. Nzinga's vision for peace was not one of submission or compromise. She understood that peace could only be achieved through a decisive shift in the power dynamic between her kingdom and the Portuguese. The time for negotiations had not yet come, but Nzinga's continued leadership and the steady accumulation of victories were slowly bringing her closer to the moment when she could force the Portuguese to the negotiating table. For Nzinga, the fight for independence was a long game, one that would require patience, resilience, and a commitment to the future of her people. But with each passing day, the possibility of achieving that freedom seemed increasingly within her grasp. As Queen Nzinga's struggle against the Portuguese Empire continued, the conflict in Angola became more deeply entrenched. The battle for the survival of Ndongo had long passed the point of mere military engagement. It was now an ideological war, where the very notion of African sovereignty was at stake. The Portuguese, having suffered significant setbacks at the hands of Nzinga's forces, were beginning to realize that their control over the region was not as secure as they had once believed. Nzinga's resistance was not simply a threat to Portuguese ambitions in Angola, but a larger symbol of African defiance against European colonization. And for Nzinga herself, this war had become more than a defense of Ndongo. It was a fight for the future of all African kingdoms resisting the tide of European expansion. Despite the heavy losses on both sides, Nzinga's forces remained resilient, and her strategic thinking continued to outmaneuver the Portuguese. While the Portuguese military was far superior in terms of weapons and resources, they lacked the deep knowledge of the land, the adaptability, and the unyielding determination that Nzinga's forces possessed. The war had evolved into a bitter struggle for control of not just territory, but the hearts and minds of the people. The Portuguese were unable to fully subdue the population, many of whom had come to see Nzinga as a figure of hope and resistance. Her ability to unite various African groups under a single cause was a testament to her extraordinary leadership. Nzinga's tactical genius had allowed her to score a number of significant victories against the Portuguese, and the years of war had honed her military skills. She understood that in order to win, her forces would need to be more than just a guerrilla resistance. They would have to be an organized and disciplined army capable of taking on the Portuguese directly. To this end, Nzinga began to invest in training her soldiers, not just as warriors, but as a cohesive force with the skills and discipline needed to confront the Portuguese head-on. In this period of heightened military preparation, Nzinga focused on fortifying key positions in her kingdom, ensuring that her forces were well supplied and that they had the infrastructure in place to withstand prolonged sieges. She knew that the Portuguese, despite their superior weaponry, could be worn down through persistent and well-coordinated resistance. And as she tightened her grip on the interior, she expanded her alliances with neighboring kingdoms, ensuring that the resistance to Portuguese imperialism was a broad and united front. However, despite her growing success on the battlefield, Nzinga faced challenges on the diplomatic front. The Portuguese had long relied on divide-and-conquer tactics, exploiting the rivalries between African kingdoms and manipulating local leaders to their advantage. But with the emergence of Nzinga as a formidable leader, the Portuguese found it increasingly difficult to secure the same degree of cooperation from African rulers. Some African kings were still hesitant to join the resistance for fear of Portuguese retaliation, while others had been co-opted by Portuguese promises of protection and wealth. Nzinga was keenly aware that her success depended not only on military might, but also on her ability to maintain and expand her network of alliances. She began to push even harder on the diplomatic front, seeking to strengthen ties with other African rulers, as well as foreign powers that might be sympathetic to her cause. She knew that the longer the war dragged on, the more likely it was that the Portuguese would seek to cut a deal with African rulers who could guarantee their safety and cooperation. Nzinga also turned her attention to the broader European political landscape, aware that the Portuguese were not acting alone in their colonial ambitions. She sought to find common ground with rival European powers, particularly the Dutch, who had interests in undermining Portuguese dominance in Africa. By seeking out diplomatic opportunities with European enemies of Portugal, Nzinga hoped to secure valuable allies who could offer military support or at the very least apply pressure to Portugal from other fronts. Despite these efforts, the conflict had already taken a personal toll on Nzinga. As the Queen of Ndongo, she carried not only the weight of her kingdom's survival, but the expectations of her people. The war, now stretching into its later years, had claimed many lives on both sides, and the suffering of her people was taking its toll on her leadership. The physical and emotional demands of the war were immense. As a woman leading a male-dominated military campaign, Nzinga often had to assert her authority against skepticism and outright opposition from some of her own military commanders who doubted her abilities because of her gender. Yet Nzinga never faltered in her resolve. Her decisions, both on and off the battlefield, were guided by the conviction that the future of her kingdom and a larger struggle for African independence depended on her ability to maintain a firm leadership. The Portuguese, despite their reinforcements and their overwhelming resources, had not managed to crush Nzinga's forces. In fact, their military setbacks and the growing resistance had forced them to reconsider their approach. They could no longer afford to waste men and resources in futile attempts to conquer Ndongo through military might alone. After years of failed offensives, the Portuguese were increasingly drawn to the possibility of negotiating with Nzinga. The Queen had made it clear that she would not surrender, and the possibility of a negotiated peace began to emerge as a practical consideration for the Portuguese. However, for Nzinga, peace was not simply a matter of diplomatic negotiation. She understood that the Portuguese could not be trusted to honor any agreement that did not serve their imperial interests. In the face of the possibility of peace talks, she adopted a cautious approach, fully aware that the Portuguese were as much a threat in negotiations as they were on the battlefield. She knew that any peace agreement would need to include provisions for the complete withdrawal of Portuguese forces from Ndongo, the recognition of Ndongo's sovereignty, and the cessation of the Portuguese slave trade. Nzinga also sought to ensure that the Portuguese could never again undermine the unity of African kingdoms in the region, and that any future contact with the Portuguese would be predicated on mutual respect and equality. The Portuguese, recognizing the pragmatism and intelligence behind Nzinga's approach, eventually agreed to formal negotiations. However, the talks were fraught with tension. Nzinga, determined to secure the best terms for her people, maintained a firm stance, refusing to allow the Portuguese to dictate the terms of peace. Her unwavering position earned her respect from both her allies and her enemies, and even the Portuguese were forced to acknowledge that they could no longer continue their campaign without risk of further escalation. The negotiations were long and difficult, but eventually an agreement was reached. The Portuguese would officially recognize the sovereignty of Ndongo, though they were allowed to maintain limited trade relations. The Portuguese were forced to relinquish their control over the interior of Angola and withdraw most of their forces from the region. While Nzinga's kingdom would remain a subject of Portuguese influence to some degree, the treaty represented a significant victory for African sovereignty and a testament to Nzinga's tireless leadership. Though the peace agreement did not mark the complete end of Portuguese influence in Angola, it was a significant moment in the history of African resistance. Nzinga had not only preserved the independence of her kingdom, but had also set a powerful example for other African rulers resisting European colonialism. Her ability to balance diplomacy and military resistance, to unite her people and forge critical alliances, and to maintain her leadership under the most trying circumstances had earned her a place in history as one of Africa's most formidable queens. With the treaty signed and her people's future secured, for the moment, Nzinga returned to her kingdom, where she began the slow and difficult process of rebuilding. But even as she focused on rebuilding Ndongo's economy and strengthening its defenses, she knew that the struggle for African sovereignty was far from over. The Portuguese had been temporarily contained, but other European powers were already eyeing the resources of the African continent. Nzinga's legacy, however, had already been cemented. She had not only fought for her people's survival, but had also fought to ensure that the legacy of African independence would endure for generations to come. In the wake of the treaty with the Portuguese, Queen Nzinga of Ndongo faced a period of both opportunity and caution. The peace agreement, though a significant victory, did not signal the end of the challenges she would face in securing her kingdom's long-term survival. For while the Portuguese had withdrawn most of their forces from the interior, their colonial ambitions were far from extinguished. Portugal, along with other European powers, still had their eyes on Angola, a land rich in resources and strategically vital for their burgeoning empires. Nzinga, ever aware of the volatility of colonial politics, understood that the peace she had negotiated was but a temporary reprieve, one that she would need to guard vigilantly. Despite her military successes and diplomatic acumen, the reality of the situation in Angola remained fragile. The Portuguese had not left the region entirely. Their influence still seeped through their coastal strongholds, and their trade networks, particularly in slaves and ivory, continued to function with the complicity of some local African rulers. Although Nzinga had managed to secure Ndongo's sovereignty, the broader fight against colonialism was far from over. Even in victory, she was acutely aware that her kingdom's security depended on staying vigilant and ensuring that her people were never again subjected to foreign domination. Nzinga's primary concern, now that Ndongo had been liberated from the Portuguese military threat, was the stabilization and rebuilding of her kingdom. The war, which had raged on for years, had left its mark on the land and its people. Infrastructure had been destroyed, villages had been razed, and countless lives had been lost. The economic toll on Ndongo was immense. Agriculture, trade, and the day-to-day workings of the kingdom had been disrupted by constant conflict. Nzinga's leadership was now focused not only on defending the sovereignty of her land, but on restoring her kingdom's prosperity, ensuring that the suffering endured during the war did not turn into permanent stagnation. The rebuilding process, however, was fraught with difficulties. Nzinga was aware that to recover, she would need to revitalize the kingdom's economy and improve its defense capabilities. The Portuguese had long depended on the kingdom's resources, and now that Ndongo had managed to retain its independence, it was critical that Nzinga turn to forging new economic partnerships and securing access to trade routes. She understood that economic independence would be just as vital to her kingdom's survival as military strength had been during the conflict. Nzinga's diplomatic skills, honed over years of negotiation and survival, were crucial in this phase of recovery. She worked tirelessly to secure alliances with other African kingdoms, many of which had also suffered under the Portuguese presence. Some of these kingdoms had fought alongside her, while others were initially hesitant to join her cause, but had been won over by her determination and success. By strengthening these alliances, Nzinga hoped to create a network of resistance against future Portuguese and other European expansion, ensuring that her kingdom could not be isolated or divided again. At the same time, Nzinga was also forced to grapple with internal challenges. As a leader, her rise had been marked by both admiration and opposition. While many of her subjects revered her as a symbol of defiance and strength, others were uneasy with her assertive leadership style, especially given the patriarchal structures that had dominated much of African societies at the time. Her decision to lead the military and make critical decisions about the kingdom's future was not without its detractors. Some of the male leaders within Ndongo, as well as leaders from other neighboring kingdoms, questioned her methods. They viewed her authority not just as a military leader, but as a political one, with skepticism. Nzinga's response to this opposition was one of strategic diplomacy. She worked to consolidate her power by bringing in loyal supporters and neutralizing those who were resistant to her leadership. She carefully balanced the demands of her military commanders, who had fought alongside her in the war, and the influential chiefs who controlled the more rural regions of her kingdom. Through a combination of persuasion, alliance building, and strategic concessions, she was able to ensure that her leadership remained unchallenged and her authority intact. However, this period of internal consolidation was not without its tensions. Nzinga had to walk a fine line between asserting her power and appeasing the various factions within her court. One of the most significant challenges during this time was the issue of succession. Nzinga, despite her strong leadership, did not have a clear male heir, which made her position as queen a subject of debate. The question of who would succeed her upon her death was a matter that needed careful handling, as it could potentially destabilize the kingdom if not addressed in a way that maintained unity. Nzinga, however, was not quick to make a decision. Her reign had been marked by pragmatism and foresight, and she understood that the choice of successor had to be one that would safeguard the future of the kingdom, one that could continue her work and her vision of an independent, prosperous Ndongo. Externally, the question of Portuguese intentions never fully disappeared. While they had withdrawn most of their military presence, there remained a powerful presence on the coast. Portugal's trade interests, particularly in the transatlantic slave trade, were too important to their empire for them to completely abandon Angola. In fact, the Portuguese would later attempt to reassert their control over Angola, attempting to reinstate their previous dominance by capitalizing on the power vacuums left by the war. It was a constant worry for Nzinga, who, despite her diplomatic and military successes, could never fully trust that the Portuguese had truly given up on their imperial ambitions. Her leadership was always under the shadow of this looming threat. Yet, Nzinga's astuteness kept her kingdom relatively safe. She was well aware that colonial powers operated not just through brute force, but through economic pressure and the manipulation of local alliances. To counter this, Nzinga worked tirelessly to ensure that Ndongo's economy was not entirely dependent on European trade routes. She turned to internal development, working to restore the agricultural sector and revive the kingdom's traditional industries. Nzinga also sought to improve the military preparedness of her kingdom, ensuring that it was capable of defending itself against any further Portuguese incursions. While maintaining vigilance on the external front, Nzinga's leadership in the years following the war was also marked by an emphasis on cultural and social restoration. The destruction wrought by years of conflict had fractured the social fabric of Ndongo. Nzinga understood that the kingdom's survival was not just dependent on military strength or diplomacy, but on the unity of its people. She encouraged the rebuilding of communities, the revival of cultural practices, and the restoration of religious institutions that had been impacted by the war. Nzinga worked to heal the emotional and psychological scars that had been left by the years of war. Her efforts to rebuild the kingdom were not solely focused on the material. They were also deeply rooted in restoring the pride, unity, and identity of her people. Nzinga's leadership also brought about a shift in the political landscape of her kingdom. Her ability to lead, as both a military strategist and a political leader, gave her the authority to reshape Ndongo's internal governance. She reformed the way power was distributed within the kingdom, consolidating authority in a way that strengthened her ability to make decisive decisions without the need for constant approval from local chiefs or factions. This centralization of power allowed her to create a more cohesive and unified kingdom, one that could more effectively resist any future challenges to its independence. Though peace had come to Ndongo, it was a fragile peace, one that required constant vigilance and careful stewardship. Nzinga knew that the challenges of her reign were far from over. Even as she focused on rebuilding and securing her kingdom's future, she knew that the larger struggle for African sovereignty was far from complete. The Portuguese were not the only threat, and the forces of colonialism were not easily driven back. Nzinga's legacy, however, was already taking shape. She had fought for her people's survival and had achieved something few African rulers of her time had managed: the preservation of sovereignty in the face of European conquest. Nzinga's name would live on not just as the queen who defeated the Portuguese, but as a symbol of resistance, resilience, and defiance against colonial oppression. In rebuilding her kingdom, she had secured a lasting legacy for future generations, and though the war may have ended, the struggle for independence and self-determination had only just begun. As the years passed following the hard-won peace between Ndongo and the Portuguese, Queen Nzinga's reign continued to evolve in complexity. The treaties she had negotiated had preserved her kingdom's sovereignty, but the reality of maintaining independence in the face of expanding European colonial ambitions was an ever-present challenge. The peace was fragile, and Nzinga, always a shrewd and calculating leader, knew that the struggles of the past were not simply confined to history. The world around her was changing rapidly, and the shifting tides of international politics meant that she could never afford to rest on her laurels. Her people's future depended on her continued vigilance and adaptability, qualities that had defined her leadership since the very beginning. Internally, Nzinga had managed to solidify her authority and consolidate her power. The years of war had seen her rise to prominence not just as a military leader, but as the unifying force of Ndongo. Having restored her kingdom's strength, she now turned her focus toward its cultural, political, and economic development. The war had fractured much of the kingdom's infrastructure, but Nzinga, with her characteristic foresight, knew that a strong kingdom could not exist without a strong foundation. She sought to revitalize trade routes, restore agricultural production, and reinvigorate the social institutions that had been strained under years of conflict. Nzinga's policies also emphasized the importance of education and the preservation of Ndongo's cultural identity. Despite the Portuguese and other European forces attempting to impose their own ways of life on the people of Angola, Nzinga was determined to ensure that her kingdom maintained its indigenous traditions and way of life. She encouraged the study of African history, languages, and customs, seeking to ensure that the younger generations would not forget the legacy of their ancestors or the struggles they had endured. Nzinga also placed a significant emphasis on strengthening the spiritual life of her people, re-establishing traditional religious practices that had been disrupted during the years of conflict. One of the most significant aspects of Nzinga's post-war leadership was her ability to balance power and diplomacy. Although she had succeeded in maintaining Ndongo's independence, she was acutely aware of the delicate nature of her position. The Portuguese may have been temporarily weakened, but they were not defeated, and their interest in Angola was far from waning. Additionally, other European powers, particularly the Dutch, had become more active in the region, and Nzinga saw this as an opportunity to further solidify Ndongo's standing on the world stage. She sought to build relationships with these rival colonial powers, hoping to keep them at bay while strengthening her kingdom's position in a complex international environment. Through her diplomacy, Nzinga managed to position herself as a leader who could not only navigate the volatile African political landscape, but also engage with European powers on equal footing. She understood that while her kingdom was strong, it was still small compared to the vast colonial empires that sought to carve up Africa. By forming alliances with the Dutch and other powers, Nzinga was able to create a delicate balance of influence in which her kingdom could survive and even thrive despite the continued presence of European colonists. But this period of diplomacy did not come without its challenges. While Nzinga was successful in forging new relationships, she had to constantly manage the tensions between maintaining her alliances with European powers and the desire to remain free from their control. She walked a tightrope, carefully navigating the politics of the time to ensure that her people were never once again subjected to foreign exploitation. She recognized that maintaining independence would not only depend on military strength, but also on the ability to manipulate the external forces that surrounded her kingdom. At the same time, Nzinga's role as a female ruler continued to be a point of contention both within and outside of her kingdom. Despite her proven abilities as a leader and military strategist, there were many who still viewed her leadership with skepticism. Some African leaders, particularly male chiefs and rival kings, were not entirely convinced of her capabilities, and her gender remained a barrier in the eyes of some. For them, the idea of a woman holding such power was an anomaly that they were not always willing to accept. Nzinga, however, never allowed these sentiments to diminish her resolve. She continued to lead with an iron will, using her intelligence and determination to prove that her gender did not diminish her strength or authority. On the international stage, Nzinga's reputation as a skilled diplomat and strategist continued to grow. Her ability to navigate the complex political realities of the time earned her respect from both African and European leaders. She became a symbol of resistance to colonial oppression, admired not only for her military successes, but also for her capacity to negotiate with imperial powers on terms that protected her kingdom's interests. In this sense, Nzinga's legacy was more than just that of a warrior queen. She was also a master of diplomacy who had succeeded where many of her contemporaries had failed. Despite the challenges she faced, Nzinga's kingdom continued to thrive, at least in the immediate years following the peace agreement with the Portuguese. Ndongo was able to rebuild its economy, and trade began to flourish once more, though it was not without limitations. The Portuguese, despite their withdrawal from much of the interior, continued to maintain a strong hold on the coastal trade routes, and the kingdom's access to these routes remained constrained. However, Nzinga was resourceful, and she found ways to bypass some of these limitations by turning to alternative trade routes and developing a more self-sufficient economy. As the years passed, the larger geopolitical environment around Nzinga began to shift once again. The Portuguese, despite their temporary withdrawal, began to make renewed efforts to regain control over Angola, seeking to reassert their authority through a combination of military force and economic pressure. The Dutch, who had been helpful in the past, were no longer as interested in maintaining their alliance with Nzinga. The shifting priorities of European powers meant that Nzinga's ability to rely on outside assistance was growing weaker. It was becoming increasingly clear that the peace she had negotiated years earlier was not a permanent solution. Instead, it had bought her kingdom time to prepare for the next phase of resistance. In response to this growing pressure, Nzinga once again turned to military preparations. While the previous years had been marked by diplomacy and rebuilding, the looming threat of renewed colonial aggression demanded that she reassert the military strength of her kingdom. She began to reorganize her forces, training them for the possibility of future conflict. The lessons she had learned in the earlier phases of the war against the Portuguese were never far from her mind, and she was ready to lead her people into battle once again, if necessary. Nzinga's leadership during this period was defined by her ability to anticipate threats and prepare for them in advance. While other kingdoms around her were caught off guard by the shifts in European interests, Nzinga remained vigilant, always planning for the worst while hoping for the best. She understood the impermanence of peace in a world dominated by colonial powers, and she made sure that her kingdom was never unprepared for the eventuality of renewed conflict. But her resilience was not just about military preparedness. Nzinga's leadership also extended to ensuring that her people remained united and determined in the face of potential threats. Her efforts to restore the cultural identity of her kingdom and reinforce its social cohesion had created a sense of shared purpose among her people. Even in the face of adversity, the people of Ndongo remained loyal to her and committed to the defense of their sovereignty. As Queen Nzinga looked to the future, she knew that her reign was far from over. The challenges of leadership, both internal and external, remained as pressing as ever. She had succeeded in securing the survival of Ndongo, but the fight for true independence, free from the shadow of colonial powers, was an ongoing struggle. The history of Africa was not yet written, and her place in that history would depend on her ability to navigate the ever-changing tides of empire and resistance. Nzinga's legacy, though still being written, was already one of immense significance. Her unwavering commitment to her people, her kingdom, and her sovereignty had made her an indomitable force in the history of Africa. While the Portuguese, the Dutch, and other European powers continued their colonial ambitions, Queen Nzinga had shown the world that resistance was possible and that the spirit of African independence could never be easily crushed. She had led her people through war, peace, and the complexities of diplomacy, ensuring that the fire of resistance would burn for generations to come. The years that followed Queen Nzinga's strategic negotiation with the Portuguese brought both stability and an ever-present tension to Ndongo. The peace she had fought for, despite its temporary nature, allowed her to focus on the rebuilding and restructuring of her kingdom, but also left her in a constant state of alertness. Nzinga knew well that peace did not equate to security in a world dominated by European imperial powers. The Portuguese were not idle in their retreat. They had simply repositioned themselves. They maintained their hold on the coastal cities, where they could control trade routes, and their colonial ambitions in Africa were far from subdued. Nzinga understood that the only way to ensure the long-term survival of Ndongo was to reinforce its independence by continuing to build military, economic, and diplomatic resilience. Nzinga had managed to outsmart the Portuguese in the battlefield and at the negotiation table, but the fight for sovereignty was far from over. Her leadership was defined not just by the ability to confront immediate threats, but by the foresight to anticipate new challenges. The complexities of maintaining the delicate balance between resisting foreign encroachment and managing internal cohesion were growing by the day. The external threat of colonial powers remained potent, but there were internal tensions as well. Nzinga had firmly consolidated power after her rise, but her rule was not without opposition, both from those within her own court and from other neighboring kingdoms who were vying for greater influence in the region. Her leadership had undeniably transformed Ndongo, yet not all was well beneath the surface. The long years of war had left scars on the land and its people, and the kingdom had to heal from the trauma of conflict. Nzinga, however, had not only become a symbol of resistance, but also a beacon of hope for her people. They had seen in her a leader who could defy the odds, resist the might of European imperialism, and safeguard their way of life. Yet the recovery from the war was a monumental task, and Nzinga knew it would take more than just military strength to ensure her kingdom's future. It required a transformation on all fronts: social, economic, and cultural. With the Portuguese still a looming presence along the coast, Nzinga began to diversify her kingdom's economy. The reliance on European trade routes and markets, while profitable in the past, was now seen as a vulnerability. Nzinga's vision for the future included the development of alternative trade networks that were independent of Portuguese control. She revitalized the agricultural sector, encouraging the cultivation of crops that could be traded within Africa and with other European powers. By creating stronger ties with inland African kingdoms, she sought to reduce the kingdom's dependence on the coastal ports controlled by Portugal. This diversification helped Ndongo regain a degree of economic independence, but it also raised suspicions among European powers, who were keenly aware that their colonial success depended on controlling African trade. Nzinga was also aware that one of the most potent weapons against European colonialism was the unity of the African continent. To this end, she sought to build a broader coalition of African kingdoms, each of whom had suffered under Portuguese or other European encroachment. Nzinga, with her diplomatic acumen, was able to foster relations with rulers across Central Africa, sharing a common goal: to resist the growing European influence that was slowly spreading across the continent. These alliances were not just political, they were also military. Nzinga believed in the importance of mutual defense, and by aligning with other African leaders who shared her vision, she built a network of resistance that would be harder to dismantle by European powers. Despite her diplomatic success, Nzinga faced ongoing threats from both Portuguese attempts at reasserting control and from rival African kingdoms. Her kingdom's location, at the crossroads of major African trade routes, made it a valuable prize, one that European powers would never fully relinquish their desire to control. The Portuguese had learned from their previous mistakes. They knew that military action alone would not be enough to defeat Nzinga. It was time to focus on destabilizing her power through other means. The Portuguese, having failed in their previous military campaigns, began to employ subtler tactics. They attempted to gain influence through intermediaries, offering gifts, trade advantages, and promises of protection to rival African rulers who were seeking to weaken Nzinga's position. The Portuguese were adept at exploiting divisions within the African kingdoms, hoping to turn allies into adversaries. Nzinga, ever vigilant, was not easily fooled. She countered Portuguese efforts by offering her own incentives to potential allies, emphasizing the importance of unity in the face of foreign domination. She also worked to consolidate her authority internally, making sure that the factions within her court remained loyal to her cause. However, not all within her kingdom supported her policies. While Nzinga had united many around the cause of resistance, her rule was still met with resistance from certain factions. The fact that she had assumed the throne at a time of crisis had earned her both admiration and resentment. Many of the older, more conservative elements of Ndongo society saw her as an upstart, a woman who had risen to power under unusual circumstances and had, in their view, disregarded traditional gender roles. The military elite, some of whom had initially doubted her leadership, had learned to respect her, but a lingering skepticism remained. These divisions occasionally manifested in opposition to her decisions, particularly regarding the forging of alliances with European powers like the Dutch, whose colonial interests did not align with the long-term welfare of African kingdoms. Nzinga, however, was not one to shy away from controversy. She continued to pursue her diplomatic and military strategies with a single-minded determination. Despite the occasional opposition from within her kingdom, she sought to protect the future of her people by positioning herself as both an advocate of African unity and a leader capable of navigating the complexities of international politics. She was increasingly aware that the future of Ndongo and the broader region rested on her ability to outmaneuver both European powers and her internal detractors. As the threat from European imperialism loomed large, Nzinga's legacy as a military strategist and diplomat became even more significant. She had proven that resistance was possible, that African kingdoms could stand against the overwhelming forces of European colonization. Yet, the peace she had fought for remained precarious. The world was rapidly changing, and Africa was being drawn into the orbit of European imperialism. The struggle to maintain independence was becoming a broader movement, one that would require the united efforts of many African leaders to succeed. Nzinga's reign was not just about protecting Ndongo, but about inspiring other African rulers to resist colonial encroachment in their own territories. Nzinga's leadership, both militarily and diplomatically, earned her the respect of not only her allies, but also her enemies. Even the Portuguese, who had once underestimated her, came to recognize her as a formidable leader. They saw her as an obstacle to their ambitions, but they also knew that she could not be easily defeated. Nzinga's influence spread beyond the borders of Ndongo, and her ability to keep the Portuguese at bay became a symbol of African resistance. She was not just a queen of Ndongo. She was the symbol of African sovereignty, a beacon of hope for all those struggling to maintain their independence in the face of foreign domination.